you've identified from a young age as an anarchist, and during that time, the popularity of anarchism has fallen and risen. And I wonder if your core philosophy, your anarchism, has evolved or changed during the course of your life.
Well, it's not what it was when I was 10 years old, but fundamentally not. But that's because the core philosophy just seems to me like common sense. I don't see how anybody can not accept it. So, the core principles, as far as I understand it, anarchism covers an extremely wide range, and all sorts of you can't encapsulate it in formulas, but it seems to me there is a sort of a thread that runs through it, and it is basically skepticism about any form of authority or domination or submission or whatever. The basic idea is that domination and hierarchy are not self-justifying. They have to justify themselves. There's a burden of proof to bear. And if they can't justify themselves, they should be dismantled. And that covers everything from personal relations to international affairs. And then out of that come various varieties of anarchism, depending on what exactly you're looking for in the future. What are the alternatives to authority, and so on. But almost everything decent in human life seems to me to fall under that. So no, that hasn't changed.
Well, the tendency of anarchism, which I guess you subscribe to, of anarcho-syndicalism, overlaps fairly closely with council communism around this notion of worker councils. And for the public at large, the assumption is that an anarchist society would be one where people ran amok, where there was chaos.
That's the propaganda. Actually, anarchist views are mostly of highly organized societies.
So what would that society look like, a society of worker councils?
Worker councils, I think, should be one component of it. So it means in any institution, say a university or a factory or whatever it is, the participants would run it. They'd run it through councils in which people participate and make decisions. Actually, it's not unlike a faculty, which is about as close to this model as you get in our world, where it's there are outside controls, but pretty much the faculty makes decisions about what happens internally. Actually, one of the things that makes university life appealing, much more so than higher paid professions, is that you're running your own life to a large extent. I mean, there are duties, but they're supposed to be shared, and shared by common agreement. And you may decide to work 80 hours a week, but it's the 80 hours that you pick, and it's the topics that you choose to work on, and it comes out of kind of like an inner need rather than external compulsion. And I think that's the kind of model everything should turn towards. So worker councils would be one component of a freely organized society, but they'd have to interact with others. So an institution, say a factory, whatever it is in a community. And the community should have a comparable form of self-organization and self-management, and then they have to interact. And it's complex interactions because many people are parts of a lot of them. As an anarchist society, the kind that I think is desirable, would develop, it would have to deal with quite concrete problems about the nature of self-government, the nature of administration. Do you want to distribute jobs so that they're fixed, or do you want circulation of responsibilities and actions? And there's no simple answer to that. Like, you want people to be trained as surgeons, let's say. On the other hand, you don't want all the dirty work done by a special category of people. So that has to be worked out. Distribution of job functions and interactions between different forms of what should be voluntary association. And there are many other problems, like what happens if somebody doesn't want to be part of take on the responsibilities of a community. I mean, those are problems that exist in any society, and they would exist in a different form in a more free society. And at this point, you have lots of different ideas. So there are people, basically anarchists, who think that payment, what you earn from your work, should be proportional to effort. There are others who think that's not an appropriate model, that it should be independent of effort. I tend toward the latter, but most of my friends tend toward the former. So, but these are real questions, and they're innumerable ones.
Well, thinking about the road to a stateless society, an anarchist society, you have written that you believe that radicals should defend those gains which have been fought for by people that are embodied in the state, such as social security, such as progressive taxation. Other anarchists might argue that this holds people within the kind of paternalistic grip of the state. Why do you come down where you do on this?
We have to ask what the alternatives are. I mean, many anarchists just consider the state the fundamental form of oppression. I think that's a mistake. I mean, of the various kinds of oppressive institutions that exist, the state is among the least of them. The state, at least, to the extent that the society is democratic, various degrees and types, but to the extent that it's democratic, you have some influence on what happens in the state. You have no influence on what happens in a corporation. They're real tyrannies. And as long as society is largely dominated by private tyrannies, which is the worst form of oppression, people just need some form of self-defense, and the state provides some form of self-defense. So to say, well, let's dismantle Social Security means concretely, let's decide that disabled widow across town will starve to death. And I don't agree with that.
In recent years, there's been a fair amount of debate about what process of fundamental transformation of society might take, what would it look like. There are those who argue that radicals need to change the world without taking power, and another position is that a revolution of some kind would be necessary. What do you think with regard to this, and do you see the role of pre-existing state formations, say nationalized industries, as playing some part in such a transformation?
I don't think there's a general answer. It depends a lot on circumstances. So, say right now, I think it would make, say with the bailout of the banks, a short-term, a dedicated anarchist might say, look, I'm not even going to talk about this, there shouldn't be any banks. That's like saying, I'm not going to talk about getting rid of nuclear weapons because everyone should live in peace. I mean, life, these things are kind of like a chess game. There's no point coming in and saying, well, I just want to mate the king. No, you got to say, well, what do you do about that pawn over there? You have to get places in stages. It's just a gift to the forces of oppression to say, well, I'm not going to talk about anything except the final state. Okay, then fine, we'll keep things as they are. So sometimes nationalization might be a positive step. Say, for the government to have, say, bought Citigroup, I think would have made more sense for them to bail it out at a far greater expense. Once it's bought, then the question comes, okay, how's it run? Is it run by the community, by its participants? Is it sold off to some other corporation, and so on? But I just don't see how there could be a general answer. You have to ask about the particular circumstances. Like I say, if you're playing chess, you have to ask about the pawn that happens to be in front of you.
One of the currents within anarchism in the US is a current which does not see class as a central axis for understanding society and thinking about a future society. Why do you think that this tendency has gotten some traction? and why do you not agree with it?
It's gotten some traction because of the decline, because the class struggle which exists has just become one-sided. I mean, there's one group of people who are basically vulgar Marxists and who are dedicated to class struggle constantly. That's the business class. It's a highly class-conscious business class. They're fighting a bitter class-conscious struggle all the time. Well, if everyone else has said, I'm going to worry about something else, they win. And that's, it's become an attractive position, for one thing, because it allows you to focus your attention on things that are quite important, but aren't going to change the class struggle. Take, say, gay rights. It's a good cause. It can be working on gay rights, but if gays had 100% rights, the institutional structure of oppression, the core of it would remain unchanged. Actually, you can see that in, say, take South Africa. Overthrowing apartheid was a major achievement, but for the majority of the population, it didn't mean a lot. Okay, now there are black faces in the limousines, but the townships are as awful or worse as they are where the class structure remained. It's just kind of one aspect of it softened, so now it's not strict white-black. Same with, and it's, there's less resistance from power centers to trying to right cultural and social wrongs than there is to trying to modify the fundamental core properties of oppression and domination. So it's easy to drift into those. And it's not wrong. I mean, it's right. Yes, you should deal with these things. But the class struggle is not going to go away unless you abandon it and say, okay, they win.
Well, switching gears slightly, I wanted to ask you about your view of science. Of course, this interview is being conducted in your office at MIT. How do you understand science? Do you think that it's socially or politically neutral?
To a degree. I mean, of course, it's influenced by outside forces. I mean, like where the science goes, where the money is, it has to. I mean, it doesn't, if, say, in my field, you can work with pencil and paper, but if you're in the chemistry lab, you just have to get money. Otherwise, you can't do anything. And the money comes from one of several sources. It could come from the government. It could come from a private corporation. That's about it. Those are the basic sources of money, and which you pick and what you do does affect the work you do. It's also what you do is affected by general cultural attitudes. So it's been argued with some plausibility, I think, that, say, in the way evolution is interpreted has been influenced by the kind of society in which evolutionary theory is developed. It's been argued with some, some degree of plausibility. I don't know how much, that the competitive, nature is red in tooth and claw, social Darwinian approach to evolution is affected by the fact that it developed within a competitive state capitalist society. One very well-known biologist who's argued this is Lynn Margulis, whose work was on symbiogenesis, arguing that species change takes place not by competition and defeat of some genes by others, but by incorporating genetic genomes essentially into other organisms, bacteria. So it's kind of a cooperative mode of evolution, if you like. It's possible that those things are influenced by general social, cultural values, and the fact that, say, nuclear physics developed is not unrelated to the fact that the military wanted, nuclear weapons. But by and large, I think science develops from its own internal needs. I mean, you can only work on the problems that are at the borders of understanding. It's one of the reasons why Pentagon supported science like MIT, like me, say, that tended to be the most free. The MIT, say, in the 60s was about 100% Pentagon funded. I was working in a lab that was 100% funded by the three armed services. It was also one of the country's centers of resistance, and there was no real conflict over that. Pentagon was funding in their view, they were, I presume, funding the development of the next stage of the economy. And from our view, we were working on things that looked interesting. So the two more or less mesh. There's some influence from one on the other.
Since the 1970s, postmodernism has had a great deal of influence on at least part of the left in this country, and it has been characterized by, among other things, as being quite critical of science and of the Enlightenment tradition. I wonder if you could talk about your view of postmodernism and whether you think that its influence is waning.
I have to say that a lot of postmodern work I just don't understand, so I can't comment on it. It seems to me some exercise by intellectuals who are talking to each other in very obscure ways, and I can't follow it, and I don't know if anybody else can. Postmodern views of science, by and large, have been pretty embarrassing, I think. There's some interesting work on this. There's a book by two physicists, Jean Bricmont and Alan Sokal, both of whom happen to be political radicals, just running through, it's mostly Paris postmodernism, what postmodern commentators have said about science. And it is really embarrassing. To the extent you can understand it. On the other hand, there is a point. Insofar as they say that everything that people do is some kind of social construction, depends on the historical context, cultural context, that part's true. I don't know if you need the whole postmodern baggage to say those things. My feeling is not. At least personally, I haven't seen anything that it doesn't seem to me has to be said in anything but monosyllables. It looks, insofar as I understand it, it's pretty straightforward. And I get the feeling that it's kind of, there isn't a drive among intellectuals to make things look difficult. It's a kind of self-protection. If what I'm doing can be done by, the guy who's repairing my furnace, okay, then who am I, And then there's those physicists over there who talk complicated things and have to, and I don't understand them, so I'd like to be like them. That drive is clearly there, and I think it should be resisted. If we can say things simply so that people can understand them, we should.
Postmodernism has also been characterized by a fairly fierce attack on the legacy of the Enlightenment.
Yeah, I have no idea what that means. I'm happy to be part of the legacy of the Enlightenment.
Well, that's what I want to ask you about. In some circles, quite an unpopular stance to take, but what does that mean to you to continue in some way the legacy of the Enlightenment?
Enlightenment, like any major movement in human life, was pretty complicated, but among its major features were commitment to ideas that I think are basically anarchist. So take, say, ideas about, take division of labor, and let's take a typical Enlightenment figure, Adam Smith. What did he have to say about division of labor? Well, here it's worth reading. Everyone's read the first paragraph of Wealth of Nations, which, Butcher does his thing, and everybody does their own thing, everything comes out fine. So division of labor is marvelous. On the other hand, if you read in a few hundred pages, he comes out as a figure of the Enlightenment. He says, division of labor will turn human beings into creatures as stupid and ignorant as a person can possibly be, because it'll drive them into repeating rote work on command. And therefore, in any civilized society, he says, the government will have to move in to stop it. Well, that's a version of a standard Enlightenment idea that your own intelligence and creative abilities derive from what you do. If Wilhelm von Humboldt, one of the founders of what we call classical liberalism, but again, a figure of the Enlightenment, he encapsulated it by saying that if a craftsperson does, he'd say craftsman, of course, if a craftsman produces a beautiful object on command, we may admire what he does, but we'll despise what he is. He's a creature, he's a tool under somebody else's control, like a machine that's producing a beautiful object. If we want that person to be a real human being, they should be doing things under their own internal impulses. And then if it creates, even maybe it's not a beautiful object, we'll still admire what the person is. Well, that's an Enlightenment idea. It grows out of conception of human intelligence, human creativity. I think it's a very good ideal. Same with some values like, say, freedom of speech. I think we should preserve that. And even the questioning of authority and dominance, that's core Enlightenment values. So I don't see what's wrong with that.
Well, I want to ask you about another set of ideas, perhaps as labyrinthine as postmodern ones, which are conspiracy theories, which have become quite popular amongst those people who identify as progressive. I know you've been fairly critical of those ideas. Why do you think that they're popular now?
Well, first of all, there are conspiracies, no question about it. In fact, sometimes sometimes they have big effects. Like take the suburbanization of America, the huge government, state, corporate social engineering projects, which were largely dedicated to maximizing the inefficient use of fossil fuels, with everything that goes along with it. Well, they may destroy the species, so it's not insignificant. But it did start as a literal conspiracy of General Motors, Standard Oil of California, and Firestone Rubber to buy up and destroy the fairly efficient electric transport system in Los Angeles and other cities, destroy it and turn it into the monstrosity that we have. Okay, that was a conspiracy. In fact, they were taken to court and fined a couple $1,000s. But looking for something hidden that's sort of beneath the surface, that's really running things, I think that's sometimes it's true, but usually it's, in my view, it turns out to be a pathology. And I think it comes from a sense that I don't like the way things are. And so there must be some hidden hand somewhere that's manipulating and controlling it. Whereas when you look closely, I think you just see the normal workings of institutional structures. That makes you, of course, raise questions about the nature of the society, who we are, how we tolerate it, and so on. So, for example, it's appealing to believe that, say, John F. Kennedy, one of the main figures in conspiracy theory, what are called conspiracy theories, it would be nice to believe he's just a fantastically wonderful guy who's going to do all kind of great things, and they shot him down just because he was so wonderful, and the world has gone off, hell in a handbasket ever since then. That's a comforting feeling. It's less comforting to recognize what I think the documentary record demonstrates in the historical record, that he was kind of a hawk who was a politician, trying to gain power by the usual techniques. He was kind of affable and friendly and smiled and knew how to butter people up. But if you take a look at what he was doing, it was pretty horrible. He was one of the worst, most dangerous creatures of the 20th century. And unfortunately, it didn't happen to blow up the world, but it came pretty close to it. That's a less comforting position. I happen to think it's largely true. Same with Barack Obama. But you can see the appeal of trying to find, take, say, Obama. There's a widespread feeling on the left, Middle Eastern commentators and so on, that he's really dedicated doing wonderful things. It's just that dark forces are preventing him. So we just have to hope that he's going to overcome the dark forces in like a hero in a fairy tale and somehow get rid of the witches and dragons and everything will be nice. I don't think that there's any truth to that. I think exactly what he seems to be. And nobody's going to ride in on a white horseback and get rid of the dragons and the witches. We've got to do it ourselves. That's harder.
Right. So would you say that conspiracy theories in general are not particularly helpful for radical politics and radical action?
If they're inaccurate. I mean, if they're accurate, as they sometimes are, sure, that helps explain the world. But most of what happens is, it's kind of, in a sense, it's a conspiracy. If the board of directors of General Motors get together and decide, okay, here's our plans for next year. Well, it's kind of a conspiracy, but we don't call that a conspiracy theory because it's the normal working of institutions. And similarly, when take, say, during the Second World War, the high State Department planners and comparable figures from the private sector, like the Council on Foreign Relations, did meet and extensively discuss the nature of the post-war world and laid plans which were pretty well executed. Well, this happened to be public, but is it a conspiracy? They got together, they worked out plans, they later implemented them, small group of people, they have special interests, not the interests of the population, but exposing that makes perfect sense. That's not what's called a conspiracy theory, because that's the way institutions operate. And that makes sense. On the other hand, I don't like to use the term because there are conspiracies. It's called a conspiracy theory if we don't like it or something. It's not the way to look at it. What you have to ask is whether the theories of a conspiracy are accurate. So let's take, say, the idea that the Bush administration plotted to blow up the World Trade Center. That attracts huge support. Maybe a third of the population believes it, and very dedicated groups of people, many of them on the left, are just committed to that. Well, is it plausible? I mean, suppose that let's say somebody conspired to blow up the World Trade Center. We know what they did. They blamed it on Saudis. I mean, would the Bush administration blame it on Saudis, thereby shooting themselves in the feet? I mean, if they wanted to bomb Iraq, so if they'd organized it, they would have blamed it on Iraqis. Then they'd have no problem at all getting congressional authorization, a UN resolution. NATO would join in, everybody would say, fine, let's invade Iraq. Instead, whoever did it blamed it on Saudis. Well, that absolves the Bush administration, short of outright insanity. Why harm your relations with a valued ally instead of blaming it on the people you want to invade? So that's already a barrier to even entertaining the possibility. And the elaborate work that goes into, is there nanothermite in building 7 or whatever it is, that's kind of beside the point. Yeah, maybe there was, maybe there wasn't, unless you have pretty sophisticated knowledge of civil engineering and structural architecture. You can't even make a judgment as to whether it means anything. But there are obvious, clear phenomena that the theory has to deal with somehow, and doesn't. And if it doesn't, I don't see a reason to take it seriously. So yes, then it becomes one of these kinds of conspiracy theory that just mislead and misdirect energy and so on. In fact, it wouldn't surprise me if, say, 40 years from now, we get declassified documents which show that the Bush administration was very sympathetic to these theories. It was diverting energy from real crimes into things that are basically a wild goose chase. Actually, we have documents like that about the Kennedy assassination. So there are Pentagon advisory documents which advise the Pentagon, the government, to periodically leak information about the Kennedy assassination, basically so as to keep people out of our hair. Let them follow those non-existent leads instead of asking us questions that we really don't want to answer.
So real conspiracy theory there.
And there we have the actual documents. And it wouldn't shock me if there's similar things about 9/11 conspiracies. I mean, they do have an immediate effect. They draw a lot of energy and effort away from major crimes, the crimes which are a lot worse than blowing up the World Trade Center. So that's convenient for the powerful. And since the theories seem to have just major logical problems that I don't see how they confront, like what I mentioned, it does seem to me the kind of theory that misleads and misdirects. And it's not hard to see why it's popular. I mean, some terrible things are going on. There should be some dark hand behind it. We hate Bush and Rumsfeld for good reasons, so maybe they're behind it.
Do you have time for me to ask you one short question? Okay, there's just one question I really want to ask you. And
there is a structure of authority here, and
yes.
Bev runs it, so I don't really have to.
Okay.
We'll sneak through.
We'll sneak it through really quickly. It seems indisputable that we're facing an ecological crisis, and there are obviously different currents within the radical left in terms of addressing it. One current within anarchism, known as anarcho-primitivism, associated with John Zerzan and Derek Jensen, argues that the only way for the planet to survive is if we go back to pre-industrial societies or even pre-agrarian societies. What do you think of that kind of view?
That's a factual claim. I mean, if they have to be right, then we have to be in favor of mass genocide on a scale that has never even been contemplated. Okay, what happens to the 6 billion people around? They can't live in a Stone Age society or an agricultural society. So if that factual claim happens to be correct, we're lost. It's not a prescription for action. I mean, nobody's proposing a course of action seriously that'll lead us to a pre-industrial society. I mean, you couldn't get 10 people to even listen to you if you suggested that. For a good reason, it means mass genocide. So it's not a prescription. It's a factual claim, which I doubt is correct. But if it happens to be correct, fine, then we're lost.
Okay, well, on that uplifting note, thank you so much for talking with me.